うん、そうなんだよ。お家から持ってきた。うん、いろいろね、お外の様子とか、めいちゃんとかエマちゃんとかの様子をね、2人に見せてあげようと思って。うん、うん、携帯持ちれるけどね。うん、オッケー。うん、そうね。あ、危ないよ、めいちゃん。どこに行こうか。この端っこがいいのかな。端っこに行こうか。
別に横一列じゃなくてもいいの？
本当？じゃあこっちあちゃんとめいちゃん横がいい？よいしょ。うん、じゃあここで座ろうか。
But I moved here years ago to go to school, acting school actually. In addition to being a tour guide, I'm also an actor in Chicago. And I decided to stay after I graduated because I really had fallen in love with the city. I fell in love with the amazing architecture that we're going to see today, all these spectacular views of the skyline and buildings that we'll get on this tour. I fell in love with the amazing food in Chicago, food from cultures all across the globe, as well as our own homegrown delicacies. If you'd like to know my favorite pizza place in Chicago, ask me later. Fell in love with the amazing culture here, all of the theater and the comedy and music, blues, jazz, and everything in between. But more than anything else, I fell in love with the people of Chicago, the spirit of the people who live in Chicago that I've come to describe as this sort of resiliency, strength, tenacity, grit in the face of problems or challenges. So what's going to happen today? We're going to see some spectacular buildings. We're going to hear all about their history and their architecture, how they came to be made. But you're also going to hear a little bit about the story of Chicago today. It's this story of resiliency. But we are also going to have exactly one boatload of fun here today. So whether you are from Chicago, from across the country, or across the world, you're now all on vacation. So sit back, relax, and enjoy your time here with us at Shoreline Sightseeing. So, first up on our architectural journeys, over here on our right, this beautiful clock tower. This is the Wrigley Building. The Wrigley Building was built in the early 1920s, about 100 years ago. Now, it is a style of architecture, and we'll talk about a lot of different styles today. We have a real diversity of styles from many eras of history on our ribbon. And this first one is Spanish Revival style. Spanish Revival. We call it that because that clock tower up there was modeled after La Giralda, which is a cathedral in Sevilla, Spain. That top of the clock tower up there is similar to the top of this cathedral that you can see in southern Spain. Now, looking at this building, this is what we were doing in the US in the early 1920s. We were copying all these European styles of architecture. In the early 1920s, the US didn't really have its own identity in architecture yet, so we were kind of copycatting Europe. And it wouldn't be until later on in the 1920s, that same decade, that we finally get a style really uniquely American. And we'll talk about that style once we're able to actually see it from the river. But in the meantime, ahead of us is a very contemporary style in Trump International Hotel and Tower. This is the second tallest tower in all of Chicago at 1,389 feet. And this is a style of architecture called contextualism. Contextualism. You see those three patios on the building. These patios all correspond to heights of neighboring buildings. The first patio corresponds to the roof of the Wrigley building that we just talked about. That second patio corresponds to the height of that pointy Mather Tower that's right across the river. And that third patio way up there corresponds to the height of a black box building that's just behind the Trump Tower. You can see its little corner right there. We'll see it in a second, but it's called the AMA Plaza Tall Black Building. But that's the idea of contextualism. It is a site-specific design, custom-made for its environment, all about blending in with your surroundings, trying to harmonize with other buildings in the neighborhood. Now, finished in 2009, it was designed by Adrian Smith. Adrian Smith, he is an architect from Chicago who has built the tallest towers in the entire world. And you'll hear more about this guy from Chicago, Adrian Smith, a little bit later on. But on our right is going to be a true local favorite. These two iconic circular towers coming up on the right called Marina City. Marina City on the right. Now, if these look familiar to you, they've been featured in many, many films, TV shows over the years, such as The Hunter, a 1980 Steve McQueen film, his last film, and most recently the recent Candyman remake featured a very grisly murder in the building. But Marina City is the official name of the building, always has been since the 1960s. But the unofficial nickname for a lot of us who work here on the Chicago River has always been the Court. In the 1960s, nobody was really living in this downtown area of Chicago here. And there was an architect from Chicago. His name was Bertrand Goldberg. Bertrand Goldberg, who wanted to change that. He wanted to attract people downtown. So he built this utopian, vertically stacked world. He built this city within a city. Because in Marina City, when these buildings were built, you could have everything you need and live above the river. In these buildings, you could find restaurants, shops, a swimming pool, a skating rink, a bowling alley, a movie theater, and of course, at the bottom, plenty of parking, a key essential to living in downtown Chicago. If you do have a car down here, parking can be very precious. And we're going to see more from this architect, more from Bertrand Goldberg, his circular designs later. He's actually one of my favorite Chicago architects ever, Bertrand Goldberg. But jumping across the river to a totally different style, this tall glass building with the crisscross panels of white granite. This is 77 West Wacker. If you look up at the top of 77, you'll notice these Greek-style temples. So this is a style of architecture called neoclassical. You take this classic design, kind of like the Parthenon in this case, and you just update it using all these modern materials of glass, steel, granite. Architects love copycatting. It's not about ripping anything off, but rather making homage to these really, really popular buildings, these popular styles, and updating them with your own spin, with your own modern technology. Now, I do want to point out this lovely little river walk over here to our left. That river walk is a relatively new public amenity that zippers together 1.3 miles of Chicago River shoreline. And it's a perfect example of a little Chicago-style resiliency, because 20 years ago, before they started to build the Riverwalk, people couldn't really come down to the river that easily. It wasn't an accessible destination for people. So the city, it invested in the future, it invested in beauty, and now you're able to enjoy the river like never before. You can go for a walk, a jog, walk your dog, have a drink, eat lunch. It's really become a true focal point of downtown is now our riverfront, which is a change. By the way, my favorite time for the Riverwalk is going to be at night. At night, it's lovely. You can walk along it, see the buildings all lit up. Totally different experience than what you're having right now. You can grab a little drink at these little bars that open up in the evening. It's a really, really fun evening activity. But speaking of the river, Chicago is here today. We are all here today because of this body of water we are on. The Chicago River is the waterway that connects the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River. That is why Chicago was built where it is, because the mouth of this river meets Lake Michigan and continues all the way eventually to the Mississippi. So we were just a really important shipping canal in the U.S., particularly in the early 1800s. And we've been a center of trade, a center of commerce ever since that time period, and that all has its roots in the location of this river. Now, people have been asking me lately, is this the natural color of the river? It's just so amazingly green, this aquamarine color. This is its color because it is lake water, green lake water that flows into the river. And the lake has been very green as of late due to an absence of algae. There's an invasive species of zebra mollusk that's eating a lot of the algae in Lake Michigan, which makes the water actually more green, which is kind of counterintuitive. However, if you ever want to see our river unnaturally green, you should come here in March for St. Patrick's Day. Ever since the 1960s, the Plumbers Union of Chicago has been dyeing this river bright shamrock green in honor of St. Patrick's Day. When I say bright green, I mean it. It is neon green. It is very intense, but it's a really fun Chicago tradition. Probably our weirdest one. So if you've never seen that before, you should come back next March. You can sail down the Green River, go to the parade downtown. People, they have a great time. I'll put it that way. But if you do come back in March, I would say bring a coat or 3. But let us return to the 1920s. Coming up on our right, in this enormous structure to the right called the Merchandise Mart. The Merchandise Mart is a style of architecture called Art Deco. Art Deco. And this has all the classic features of the Art Deco style. Deep, dark windows, soaring vertical lines like racing stripes drawing your eye up, 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 up. This polished Indian limestone tan color. There are gold details of expectations. If each generation kind of takes their own values and expresses them in 3 dimensions through architecture, then the Merchandise Mart and Art Deco were expressing the luxury, the optimism, the hope for the future of the roaring 1920s. Which, as we all know, came to a roaring halt. But I'll get to that later, because we're about to enter one of my favorite spots on the river and one of the best photo opportunities on the river, and that is called Wolf Point. Wolf Point, where you will be able to see nearly 360 degrees of pure glass skyscraper. Let's start on the left with the Nuveen building, this curving green building here. The Nuveen building is another example of contextualism, because you'll notice this curve in the building is mimicking the curve here in the river. And the blue glass matches the blue of the sky, and the turquoise matches the green of the river. So that is contextualism as well. You're trying to blend in with the natural context. In this case, it's our beautiful green curving river. Now straight ahead of us are these dueling glass buildings of pretty interesting shape. The one on the left with that Y-shaped base, put a pin in that one. We'll talk about it in a few minutes. But straight ahead of us is River Point from just 2017 with that giant spiraling red sculpture in front of it. Now River Point with those arches at the top, at the bottom, I have started calling this one the Hot Pocket, or the ticket, or the deodorant stick, or the McDonald's apple pie box, whatever it looks like to you. With that archway at the bottom though, it has a really important function, so that the building's caissons, basically the foundations of the building, that they don't interfere with the Metro and Amtrak train lines that run right underneath this side of the river. Now that is a very new building. It is just 6 years old, but let's look at the oldest building on the river. Straight ahead of us, this pinkish reddish building here, Fulton House. Fulton House was built in 1898, 125 years ago. And before it was a beautiful condo building like it is now, it was a cold storage freezing building. It was an enormous freezer for the meatpacking industry. Meatpacking, huge industry for us in the early 1900s. Meat was Chicago's export. Chicago is called the hog butcher of the world, the city of broad shoulders of our very strong meatpacking workers. They would bring all this beef and other meats to this building, freeze it in Fulton House right there, and then they would ship the meat across the country on trains like the ones that used to run on the Upraise Bridge. Speaking of, this is the Carroll Avenue Railroad Bridge. It is a 1908 historical landmark bridge that is permanently raised in that upright position. But you see this big piece of concrete to the right of the bridge, so that concrete block swings down 90 degrees or so, and that lets that top part of the bridge that's up go down. You raise it back up to where it is now, and that lifts the bridge into the air. It works just like a seesaw. It's called a Trunnion Bascule Bridge, but you can also just call it a Chicago-style bridge because they all work in that exact same way. But on our left, one of my favorites on the river, the river cottages. You'll notice these river cottages to the left have a triangular design and those kind of porthole windows, almost like it's reminding you of a sailboat. That's because the architect, Harry Weiss, he was an avid sailor, and he put these kind of nautical themes into many of his buildings. But when Weiss built those cottages in the 80s, people thought he was nuts, and not really for the design. See, back in the 80s, nobody really wanted to live on the north branch of the river we're turning onto now. The north branch here used to be a kind of smelly, gross, industrial branch of the river, and people did not really want to be down here. Now you can see that kind of old attitude for the river over here on the right in the East Bank Club. The East Bank Club on the right is a long, swanky fitness club. It is a gym, and you'll notice it looks like we're looking at the back of that building. That is because we are. It's almost like it's turning the river as its alleyway. It's kind of turning its back on the Chicago River. But that was the old attitude. Nobody wanted to look at the river, let alone live on it. But as you can see over on the left, there are beautiful condos, beautiful townhomes down here now. There are definitely some people who want to live on the north branch of the river. So our river here is really bouncing back in this major beautiful and beautifying way. And our relationship to our river is changing as the health of our river continues to improve. And we'll talk more about that later. But we are now going to make a little U-turn. We're going to head down to the south branch of the river, where there's more amazing things to see, including the tallest tower in all of Chicago. Give you a chance to visit our amazing bartender Aaron downstairs, grab something to drink, and hey, stay hydrated out here. It's getting very hot. And I am up here in the meantime. If you have any questions at all, just say, hey Ricky, just raise your hand. I will come right over to you. Okay, see you in just a couple of minutes. They're stubborn, they are nostalgic. So if you ask a true lifelong Chicagoan, you know, hey, what's the name of this really, really tall tower? They are probably going to yell at you that that is the Sears Tower. And do not use that other name. Believe me, people care a lot about this. But in case it is confusing, Sears Tower, Willis Tower is again same exact building. Now, if you look up at the top right now, you can see those 5 glass boxes at the top. So those glass boxes up there are called the ledge. You can actually go up to the top of the building. You can stand in those glass boxes, and you can look down over 1,300 feet. It is terrifying, in my opinion. I'm pretty afraid of heights, so not for me. But I'm sure everyone's much braver than I am. You'd enjoy that definitely amazing view up there. So think about the sky deck at the top of the Sears Tower. Now, speaking of being afraid of heights, though, nevertheless, my favorite fun fact about the Sears Tower is that it has been successfully climbed 2 times. The first person to climb it was an American. His name was Dan Goodwin. Dan Goodwin climbed it wearing a Spider-Man costume, and he used suction cups. And the second was a French guy. His name was Alain Robert, who climbed that building using no equipment. He was called free soloed the face of the Sears Tower with his bare hands, using just the window ledges, and he did it in a little over 1 hour. He really did. You know, don't climb towers. Bad idea, moral of the story. Now I'd like to talk about a Chicago nickname that I've already mentioned today, but I'm sure you've heard it before I said it, called the Windy City, in the sense that Chicagoans are long-winded, or boastful. See, back in the 1800s, Chicagoans were known to brag about Chicago, kind of talk a lot about how great the city was, and our politicians were known to be very smooth-talking, slick. These politicians would sort of say